Also, if you want to Twitter, you are more than welcome to do so. And the hashtag is BRIGG. So Twitter, probably. Thank you.
Is it on? Thank you. Is it working? No. Is it working? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's one thing that's really clear. The BRI can definitely include this. It's really useful here. Hi everyone, my name is Suresh Nanwani, and this is going to be an interesting panel. And what I'm going to do is just to make it really brief in terms of introducing. My speakers here have pretty good credentials, but for me, it's all in the conference booklet, and I'd rather spare the time in focusing on what they have to present and the audience engagement. To me, that's really important because you are here, and that's really important that it becomes a wholesome event. So I have with me Professor Yamada from Japan, Professor Fabian Bosway from Ghent University, and Ms. Anna Sarena from the European Parliament. I will not go into their details because I think that's not really relevant here. You can read them in the conference booklet. And without further ado, let's have the first speaker, Professor Yamada. And of course, the perspective here of this panel is perspective on the BRI from the EU and Asia. And I think that's interesting because we started off with a general basis, and now we're going to do specifics as my revelation on. Thank you very much.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah. Then this is yours.
Not really, man. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and hello, everyone. It's my greatest honor to be a member of this panel. Just one personal footnote. I came from Tokyo with students, Chinese students. They might feel uneasy if we only talk about the threats of the nation, and it's unfair to do so. All the song of Bob Dylan goes like this: you are right on your side, and I'm right on mine. So I'm not going to support either Japanese side or Chinese side. Having said that, let's get started. Japan is located at the eastern end, outside the regions we are talking about. Then Japan has nothing to do with the initiative? Of course not. Japan has huge interest in the initiative, and its interests are both political and economic, plus advantageous and disadvantageous to Japan's security and economy. To illustrate the point, we will examine three things: the preferences or concerns of Japanese government, those of Japanese companies, and the relationships between the two. The main concerns of Japanese political leaders and business leaders are different, and that gives them a very big dilemma. And the dilemma has led the government to take a pragmatic, case-by-case approach rather than to form a clear-cut grand strategy toward the BRI. That's my conclusion. Now let's start with the government. The foremost concern of Japanese government is that China might pursue military build-up in the name of economic cooperation. One example that the Japanese government and security officials carefully watch is the port of Duqm in Oman. Nearly $300 million will be invested in the port, and the loan was made by China-led AIIB. China also acquired vast land surrounding this port. So here's the concern. Port of Duqm can host huge ships, and it's equipped with dry docks, which you need to repair and maintain those huge ships. And the port is in the middle of a sea lane connecting the Middle East and Asia. It is crucial for Japan because the nation relies more than 80% of imported oil upon the Middle Eastern producers. Similarly, big concern is Sri Lanka, where China could control the southern port of Hambantota. Most of its constructions were financed by Chinese banks, and a few years ago, the loan fell into default. Sri Lanka had to give the management authority to a Chinese company owned by Chinese government over the next 99 years. China promised not to use the port for any military purposes, but other nations fear that this is a business model of China in BRI. They lend huge sum of money to less developed nations, let them go bankrupt, and take control of the facilities in return. These moves make Japan worry about the expansion of Chinese influence in the whole region. If you connect the ports in Oman and Sri Lanka, you find a string of pearls that looks like a necklace. This is extremely a big concern, threat to India, but to Japan as well, to keep a sea lane to the Middle East. That's why President Trump and Prime Minister Abe together have announced a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, the Euro area, which overlaps with China's BRI. The Japanese government has not only security concerns but also economic concerns. According to one estimate widely cited in Japan, so far 90% of the BRI-related contracts have gone to Chinese companies, while local companies in the region could get only 7%. In contrast, in World Bank and ADB loan projects, Chinese companies have only 30% of the contracts. So 90% in the BRI is extremely high. Now let's move on to the business. Their foremost concern is, of course, the huge profits that the BRI seems to promise. Estimates vary, but Swiss Re, a global reinsurance company, estimates that by 2030, the BRI profits will amount to approximately $7.5 trillion. You can give it up. And those projects are mostly for infrastructure, which the Japanese companies desperately want. Just a few years ago, in Indonesia, a team of Japanese companies competed with Chinese team for the construction of Java high-speed rail that connects the east and west in the nation. It was a big project, 150 kilometers long, and after a very tough competition, Japan was defeated. It was a shock to Japanese business leaders who believed that they had robust competitiveness in a fast and reliable rail system called Shinkansen in Japan. BRI has some other railroad projects in, for example, Thailand, Laos, and Malaysia. And there are many other big projects that the Japanese companies really want to get involved. But so far, Japanese companies are not fully involved, but the stock market has already shown some positive signs to those companies that possibly engage in BRI business. The stock price of these companies seems to be improving because the investors expect their business getting better as the BRI proceeds. So here's a big dilemma. We want it, but it looks deadly threatening. So what shall we do? Their answer is, it seems to me, case-by-case approach. And this approach came out of a series of dialogue between the business and the government of Japan. This is the timeline of how it's evolved in the past several years. In 2013, when the AIIB started, Japan announced, along with the United States, it would not join it, claiming that the bank lacked transparency and democratic decision-making system. And the Japanese government hesitated to show its commitment to the BRI as well at the beginning. But gradually, the government gets inclined to pro-business attitude as the economic opportunities are showing up larger and larger, and the business leaders start raising their voices. A turning point came in June 2017 when Prime Minister Abe announced that Japan would cooperate with China for the BRI. Later that year, Abe met with Xi Jinping in APEC summit meeting and re-emphasized that the cooperation is critically important. Then, at the end of the year, the government went one step forward to announce the general guidelines for Japanese companies. The guidelines is titled Guidelines for Cooperation between Japan-China Businesses in Third Countries, meaning in the countries of BRI. And it says that the government will support the cooperation between the two countries' private firms as long as first, the facilities they build are open to everyone, meaning they should not be used only by China, whatever the purpose is. And second, their projects should be economically feasible, meaning they should not impose the developing nation a huge loan that the country cannot repay without sacrificing its national economy. And third, their procurement should be fair and transparent. That is, it should not be that only Chinese companies may bid for it. So you can see these three conditions correspond to the main concerns of the Japanese government that I already mentioned. Here are some examples that the government views appropriate. One, environmental projects like wind power, solar power generation, and two, industrial development, such as building industrial complexes with sophisticated ICT facilities. And three, logistics and transportation, for example, joint planning of transportation using the high-speed rails. Well, guideline is guideline, it's not law, but in Japanese business-government relationships, historically and even today, the companies are expected to follow the guidelines the government set. But as you can imagine, these guidelines are not specific enough. So the companies should ask, can we do this? Can we do that? And the government would tell them tell them on case-by-case basis, the government will ask which Chinese companies are partners, in what kind of projects, where it takes place, how much they spend, how the costs financed and repaid, and so on. If it looks okay, then the government will financially support the participating companies. To conclude, I think Japan is taking a pragmatic, case-by-case approach to the BRI, rather than showing any grand strategies or principles. Therefore, a lot are still to be seen in the coming months or in years. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Yamada. Thank you also for keeping to the timeline. It's really very much appreciated. And we have next Professor Fabian. She will now present. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning everyone. So I will be talking about China's involvement in Central Asia. So the research I've been doing starts from a number of observations. The first one being that in recent years there has been growing academic attention to China as an international development actor. At the same time, China has become increasingly active in Central Asia, a region that particularly interests me. However, we still know quite little about what China is doing in Central Asia, and in particular about the impact that it has in this region. And this despite the fact that China has become so active in this region, and also even since the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. Although we have all these grand stories about the initiative, we don't know really what is going on the ground and what impact China's projects have. So this then led me to do an explorative analysis of China's involvement in the Central Asian countries and to look in particular at two questions. So first of all, to what extent does China's assistance have an impact on the ground in Central Asia? And secondly, to what extent are the Central Asian countries receptive to China's assistance? So in exploring these questions, I've looked first at what existing studies tell us about the effectiveness and the impact of international aid. So typically existing studies would refer to two types of explanatory factors in understanding the effectiveness and the impact of international aid. So on the one hand, they refer to the domestic or recipient-related factors. On the other hand, they refer to donor-related factors. So for the first category, domestic factors, typically development studies point to the absorptive capacity. So the higher the absorptive capacity of developing country, the more likely that the international aid will have an impact, especially in the long run. And the same goes for the governance performance and the institutional capacity of the developing countries. So the higher their governance performance and institutional capacity, the more likely that international aid will have a lasting effect. When it comes to the donor-related factors, typically development studies now will distinguish between the DAC donors and the non-DAC donors. So DAC donors are basically countries that are a member of the OECD DAC committee, so that's the committee that is responsible for setting international principles for delivering development aid. China is not a member of the OECD DAC, so it falls in the category of so-called non-DAC donors. And what we find there, when we look at the literature, is that typically these donors actually are quite effective in providing aid, in the sense that their aid delivery is fast and efficient. Also, the aid is characterized by low transaction costs. However, at the same time, their aid delivery is also rather non-transparent, and it often comes at the expense of governance, human rights, the environment, social issues, and so on. And then what does literature say about receptiveness of developing countries to international aid? Well, normally receptiveness to international aid provided by the non-DAC donors, such as China, is higher than receptiveness of developing countries to aid provided by DAC donors. But this is particularly for developing countries that are governed by authoritarian regimes, which is the case for the Central Asian countries. And why is this so? Well, typically the aid provided by non-DAC donors does not involve political conditionality, and they will not interfere in domestic affairs. And obviously this is much to the liking of authoritarian regimes. Let's now have a look at China's involvement in Central Asia. So at the level of the aid modalities that China uses, we see that some of the projects are provided through grants, but most of the projects, and this applies also to the aid provided by China in other regions, so most of the projects is through soft loans. So it's not for free, so they have to be paid back. Then in terms of the priority sectors where China is involved in Central Asia, most of the assistance goes to infrastructure. So this is transport infrastructure, so roads, tunnels, railroads, especially now on the Belt and Road Initiative, this has increased dramatically. Also electricity grids. And then secondly, China invests a lot in the extractive sector and in the energy sector. Interestingly, a lot, I would say most of the aid goes in fact to the two poorest countries in the region, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. So this is not a surprise. So China believes that because these are the poorest countries, they are most in need of assistance. We should exclude then investments in the energy sector, because neither Kyrgyzstan nor Tajikistan actually have energy sources. So if we would then include Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, then actually we see that China also invests enormous amounts of money in those two countries. Now, to give you some concrete illustrations of what China is doing, I can treat you on a number of pictures. Some of them I've taken myself, not the first few. So this one here shows Chinese workers building a tunnel of a highway in the mountains of Tajikistan. Here you see Chinese workers building a road on the mountain pass between, one of the mountain passes between Kyrgyzstan and China. And this is now the first of the pictures I've taken myself when I did a field trip to Kyrgyzstan. So this is a hospital that was built and fully financed by China. So typically when it comes to social or soft infrastructure like hospitals and schools, this is financed through grants. So this is not through loans. It's mostly the hard infrastructure that is financed through soft loans. So here this was the board that you will find outside of the hospital. So this was financed through China Aid, and it was constructed through the China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation. And if there's still any doubt that this was Chinese made, in the hospital you have also exit signs in Chinese, very convenient for the local population. Okay, then let's move on to the findings of my research. So the first question, so to what extent does China's assistance have an impact on the ground in Central Asia? Well, I come to the conclusion that the impact of China's aid is actually tangible and pervasive. Why? Well, first of all, compared to what other donors are doing in Central Asia, China is really offering enormous amounts of funding. Of course, it's a bit disputed because are we talking about development aid? Are we talking about foreign direct investment? Well, of course, there is not a clear boundary between those two. In the case of China, or with other donors, this is a much more clear distinction. Then secondly, China is really investing in projects that have direct benefits and very visible benefits. So they are investing in the construction of roads, bridges, electricity grids. So this is of course very visible for the local population. But then there's the but. So unfortunately, the benefits for Central Asian countries are being offset by the negative implications of China's assistance. First of all, unfortunately, China's assistance involves hardly any competence in capacity building. So this is of course not good in terms of the sustainability of these projects. Sustainability so far also is not really a criterion that China takes into account when it is thinking about projects that it wants to finance in Central Asia. Another point is that only few jobs are created as a result of China's investments. As most of you know, China prefers to work with Chinese workers. Also, there are no technology transfers taking place. Now, I must admit that recently China has been trying to take these critiques into account, and it has been adapting. So to some extent now we can already witness some transfers of technology. We can already witness that, for instance, in Kazakhstan, China is accommodating the critique of the government that it's not really involving local workers. So to some extent we are seeing some changes. That being said, it's still the case that local companies, they are unable to compete with Chinese companies. And so far also we don't see any grassroots exchanges or societal engagement. Also, knowing that most of the assistance is provided through loans rather than through grants, there is now, of course, a serious financial risk, especially for the poorest countries, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, who now have to repay these loans. So all of this means that the Central Asian countries' dependency on China is further strengthened. This is, of course, not good in the long term. And also, as a further side effect, we see that there is an increased mistrust and antipathy towards China across the region. And this is especially at the level of the population. It's less so for the local elites. What is interesting is that a lot of this is actually reminiscent of the early days of the Bretton Woods financial institutions, namely the IMF and the World Bank. To what extent can we explain this? Well, of course, this has to do with also the model that these institutions in the early days were promoting, which is very similar to the model that China is now promoting. Then with respect to my second question, to what extent are the Central Asian countries receptive to China's aid? Well, if we only look at the receptiveness of the domestic elites, so not really the population at large, we see that the receptiveness to China's aid is rather high, and this is so across the entire region. Why this is so? Well, they very much like the fact that China is quick and efficient in its aid delivery, and also extremely generous, although we have to take that with a pinch of salt, knowing that it's mostly loans. And also the local elites, of course, appreciate that China does not has any political conditions tied to its aid, and that it does not interfere in the domestic affairs. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was really good. I enjoyed it. Very thought together with Professor Kamara as well, the presentation. And now we have Anna.
Good morning, everybody. It is a great honor for me to be here today in this panel. I am actually touching base on the EU perspective on the Belt and Road Initiative, of course addressing challenges and opportunities. European Union and China relations have come a long way under the strategic partnership, which is guided by the EU-China 2020 strategic agenda for cooperation. It is the top-level document today, and it was actually adopted in 2013, coinciding the establishment or the first public signs of the Belt and Road Initiative. In July 2016, the EU adopted a new strategy on China, setting out its own interests. The EU-China Summit statement in 2018, very recently in July, shows that, in fact, the relations are deepening. Why I'm saying this? Because, for example, in 2017 and 2016, there are no joint statements due to the divergences of the views in certain top issues. The renewed positive impact that EU-China partnership can have applies in partly when it comes to addressing global and regional challenges, promoting multilateralism, open and fair trade based on the multilateral trading system under the auspices of the World Trade Organization, and of course respecting international law and universal values and the rules-based international order. EU and China are the two of the biggest traders in the world. The EU is China's biggest trading partner, while China is the EU's second largest trading partner. The trade in goods between the EU and China is worth over 1.5 billion euro a day, a single day. I would like to mention that the first Silk Road train, exclusively designated for Antwerp, arrived this year on the 12th of May 2018. Technological development, business innovations, and digital economy, and falling production, trade, and transport costs, also due to the PRI perhaps, continue to transform global patterns of production. China is an integral part of the global value chain, while the country is increasingly sourcing intermediate goods domestically and following up the so-called Made in China 2025 strategy. Foreign direct investments bring substantial benefits for both EU and China in terms of economic growth and jobs. Comprehensive EU-China investment agreement negotiations are a top priority and a key project in the efforts to establish and maintain an open, predictable, fair, non-discriminatory and transparent business environment. And of course, also ensuring protection of investors and investments. This in turn would benefit projects like just like a PRI. Let me turn now on the President China's BRI politics, I call it as a global form of connectivity politics because it concerns both the foreign and domestic ones. The BRI is a major tool on these aims to construct a variety of transport links and energy infrastructure throughout Asia, the Middle East, Central and Eastern Europe, Africa, you can see it from the map, and Latin America. However, China has very recently, if you look at from the north, despite not being a non-Arctic state, extended its ambition for Arctic shipping route called the Polar Silk Road. Along this Indo-Pacific dimension of the Belt and Road Initiative, it reflects China's ambition to become a global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence between 2035 and 2050. Challenges. Connectivity goes beyond investment in infrastructure, as we have learned earlier already this morning, and encompasses international lending, foreign cooperation, and influencing institutions in research, finance, and policymaking. Acquiring international communication outlets and disseminating technical and regulatory standards. Somebody said this morning that there is a thirst for infrastructure funding. Indeed, the Asian Development Bank has stated that there is a USD 26 trillion cap on infrastructure investment in the developing Asia. The EU and China continue to forge synergies between Belt and Road Initiative and the EU's own initiatives, such as the EU Investment Plan and extended EU trans-European transport networks, and to promote cooperation in hardware and software connectivity through interoperable maritime, land, rail, and air transport, energy grids, as well as digital network. The first co-investment on the 6th of August 2018, very recent one, by the China-EU Co-Investment Fund, was actually allocated to Pathway Mid-Cap 1 fund, which is backed by the Pathway Limited Partners, China Development Bank, which is of course under the direct leadership of the State Council, and a French Public Investment Bank. However, the EU does not have a common position on the Belt and Road Initiative, such as any kind of scheme connecting Europe and Asia. The Belt and Road must abide by shared principles of market rules, transparency, open procurement, and a level playing field for all investors comply with established international norms and standards. As there have been symptoms and critics, as we have heard already this morning, it also should take into account of individual situations of the third countries concerned. To extent to which the Belt and Road Initiative has an impact also to EU cohesion. It has actually given kind of tensions through the 16+1 platform, for example. The 16+1 is covering 16 EU member states plus 5 Western Balkan countries. Most of them are actually a part of following the candidacy of the EU member states. And while China considers the Western Balkans one of the key corridors in Europe as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, growing Chinese influence may conflict indeed with the wider strategic geopolitical objectives of the countries in the region. Based Based on China's current political approach and connectivity politics, the EU could formulate its own policy going far beyond the realm of infrastructure. Indeed, I have a pleasure to announce that the EU is currently in the process of preparing its own connectivity strategy under the concept of sustainable connectivity between Europe and Asia, perhaps providing a more comprehensive response to the Belt and Road challenges. Let me now turn to my institution, the European Parliament. I would like to state that I am the sole responsible for this presentation, and any opinions do not necessarily respect the official position of the European Parliament. However, the European Parliament committees, as you may know, notably the Committee of Foreign Affairs and the Committee of International Trade, are closely monitoring the EU-China political, economic, trade and investment developments. The European Parliament delegation for relations with China is engaged in structured dialogue with the Chinese authorities about all aspects of the EU relations in China, including those related to the connectivity and the Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anna. So we have seen quite interestingly, and I really enjoyed this because in this panel, what I have seen, and I'm going to open the floor to the audience presently, three dimensions. One is first from Japan, one end of China, and the second is from Central Asia, so that's midway on the map there, looking at it from that perspective. And the third is EU at the other end, and I think that's interesting, you know, and I think I should thank Maria for having presented this, because I think this is excellent. We have three dimensions cushioning the problem here, Japan and EU, and in the middle we've got Central Asia, and I've seen certain trends, what I call golden threads, that I like to articulate and, you know, put it out for suggestion and get the panelists to speak up as well. What I've seen in the case of Japan and EU, certain statements being made, whether by way of general guidelines or articulations, open procurement, level playing field, you know, that kind of concern that we can see why these countries have made those certain requirements that should be out there. And in the middle, of course, we have what we call sustainability issues here. And I'm kind of interested because, and I want to tease this out, and I'm just going to raise it here, and it can be fed back later on, the issue of what Fabian has mentioned about DAC and non-DAC countries. And I want to tease this out in terms of new architecture of financial lending. Just bear in mind, we're dealing here with China, yeah? And of course, the traditional one is MBBs, IFIs, or even with export credit agencies, they conform to a certain standard. But in the case of China, there are lots of posits made that it's not good enough. I want to question, why are we dealing with the DAC standard, and is there now a non-DAC standard that's coming up? I still see that as interesting because, in one sense, when you have the MDBs or the IFIs, you have what's called a project cycle. You have evaluation. Would we have evaluation here? Would it be fed back? You know, sustainability is an issue that's always still a concern for China projects. And is that fed back in terms of evaluation? Who evaluates it? And one of the concerns I have is no interference in domestic affairs. I think that's kind of a concern because in the case that was highlighted earlier on, the result of the port in Sri Lanka, where it was leased back to China authorities, You wouldn't have that typical situation in a typical IFI landing, whereas here you would have it. So our party is really equal here. The next one I want to point out is the 16 plus 1 countries, and that's really to do with the Europeanization. I see that as interesting because you've got 16, and this is going to be really a test case of how EU conducts itself with China and its connectivity strategy that Anna has mentioned, whether that is a bit reactive rather than proactive. Other than that, I'd like to posit it to the floor. When I'm opening the questions, could you just raise your hand and identify who you are? Make it short and just say who the question is really for, so I can then get the panelists to speak. Thank you very much. Raise your hand. Okay, let me just have a, wow, okay, that's good. Okay, I can see, Krista, yeah, go ahead. I see you here first, and then I'll pass it around later. Good, thank you.
Merci.
Okay.
J'ai just
Next, that's fine, thank you.
a question for
Could you identify yourself?
Pierre Borgers. I was responsible for cooperation with South Caucasus and Central Asia for 2002 to 2013. And my question relates to the relations which EU has established with China on the matters of global governance. And I would just refer to a resolution done or discussed by the Parliament a few days ago. How do you see this platform for cooperation with China to be developed? My second observation is on the presentation by Mrs. Bossiut, saying what are the impact of Chinese investment. I think one should also consider the direct impact during the works being done by the multiplier effect set up by the infrastructures. And I could refer to a couple of examples like the tunnel built by the Chinese between the Fergana Valley and the rest of Uzbekistan, which has been a bottleneck for more than 30 years, or the highway between Bishkek and Isikul, which is one of the prior attractive points for its tourism development. I'm saying one should look maybe at the direct and indirect impact and the time it takes for it to be realized. And finally, when talking about investment of China, we could refer to the AIIB, where more than half of the investment done by this bank are made in co-financing with international financial institutions. Is there a learning process by which the investment done by China are improving over time? Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just make a request? I've been provided this tip here that if you ask questions, just limit yourself to one or at the most two, and of course we can have offline discussions as well. Because I did see about 6, 7 hands raised up. Yes, in the front row.
Yes, hello. You know me since before, right? A quick content question. I think it's for Mrs. Busu. Over the past 5 years, there's been an increasing gap between Chinese foreign, pledged Chinese foreign investment and actual Chinese foreign investments. Still, in Asia, still investment in that region has increased, has gone up at the same time, right? So, I mean, that's a given answer. Who is filling that gap? But what's the implication of these international financial institutions and AIIB making up that gap? What's the implication of that? The other one is about debt trap. You know, we say that countries are becoming indebted. But what's the rationale behind that? Why does politicians in those recipient countries agree to put themselves in these traps? You know, it's simple mathematics, how much it costs and how much revenues you have, right? Let's also give an answer, but you know, why? And why are they still in power when they make these kind of political decisions? Thank you.
Thank you. Powerful question. Could I go now to, I think, the gentleman over there? Yes?
First, I thought it was here, so just...
Okay, yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Astrid Skala. I'm from Germany, GSZ, the German Development Agency. I have the pleasure to talk to the audience later. So only a very short question, which goes to Professor Yamada. I'm a China expert. Unfortunately, I've never been to Japan. Don't know anything about your culture, business culture, and I was really surprised that your government issues guidelines vis-à-vis how your business sector is supposed to act and react vis-à-vis Better Known Initiative. So I was just wondering if the German government decides to issue guidelines for the German business sector, how that would look. So my question is, we have observed in Germany and Europe that the business sector is taking a totally different approach towards the BRI than the politicians and our governments. The German, I can only speak for Germany, the German business sector is now very much pro-BRI. We have seen big conferences by Siemens and German banks in Beijing. So I was just wondering, is there also a difference in the approach of your business sector and the government? And is the government not only guiding and telling the business sector what to do, but also supporting them and accompanying them to help them that things like, just as you have said, has happened, that we have lost against the Chinese in Indonesia will not happen again, and that the Japanese business sector will also can take opportunities in the BI. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman over there, the one in blue shirt. Sorry, am I missing out someone in front? Because we have still about 4 at the back. Thank you. Could you please keep it short? One, if not two.
I'll keep it
Thank you.
very short. Aaron Flybo from New York University Law School. I had a question about Central Asia. You had mentioned just sort of in passing about, I think it was Kazakhstan had sort of pushed back a little bit on this trend of China using Chinese workers. I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit about how they're pushing back, why Kazakhstan, and what's you expect to change, if anything. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the lady in red, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie Mitchell from the European Parliament. My question is for Professor Dr. Busseit. You very clearly and concisely elaborated the factors which reinforce authoritarian regimes, as well as those which maybe act as a kind of storage battery for future discontentment, lack of local jobs, lack of social involvement. I'm recalling an instance a few years back where a Chinese NGO reported back to the State Council on dissatisfaction in Myanmar regarding dam projects and basically looking at lack of social involvement and why Chinese aid or support or investment was seen in a different light from other investors and partners. Would you dare to draw a balance between the two sets of factors you've outlined and predict a bit about the evolution? You've described the present situation very well, but how would you see it evolving in the medium or long term, towards reinforcement or towards instability? Thanks.
Thank you. Next to her, I think down, you see the gentleman there? Yes, he's standing up, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, this is Ira from Erasmus University Rotterdam. Actually, I have questions to Professor Yamada, because when I was reading your abstract, I have a quite interesting thing. Because geographically speaking, China also has a Pacific coast. So my question is with regard to the CPTPP, which I think among all the countries, Japan is also the leader of the economies. So my question is whether in some situations, like China is also being blocked in international investment and trade? Thanks very much.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, the last part of your question, that part got missed?
My question is whether in some situations China is also being blocked in international investment
It's
and
also
trade.
being what? Sorry?
Blocked.
Blocked.
Yes.
Did you get the question? No, he didn't get. Can you please say?
Whether China also gets blocked. Chinese investment gets blocked by countries, by host countries.
By which country?
Rejected.
Rejected by?
Asking for examples.
Could you repeat your question? I'm sorry. It's better to get it straight from the gentleman.
China is rejecting.
Just
Okay,
say.
I change another way of saying, like, whether the world in some situations and the world, some part of the world does not want to play with China in international investment.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the gentleman right there at the back raising his hand. Yeah, just one more. The gentleman right there in the grey coat. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard from the External Action Service. Just one quick question regarding Central Asia. There was no mention of land issues because there were big debates and big land cessions to China in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and about possible land reclamation around projects and debt for equity swaps, which is also something quite possible in Central Asia. And there was the EU position on Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, well, the EU has not taken a public position, but I can say that does mean that the EU doesn't have concerns and has expressed it to China, including in the recent summit. There are a lot of exchanges with the Chinese officials on that, and also member states like France and Germany have said what they think about need for reciprocity, both ways, transparency, etc.
Thank you. I'll put the questions to a close for the time being. Let me now open the floor to the panelists to respond. First will be Professor Yamada, and then Fabian, and then Anna. And for lack of time, we can always go offline to discuss that, and other questions that may be asked can also be put offline. Thank you very much. Professor Yamada.
Well, because Fabian has a lot of questions, so my answer will be very small. Why the first one? I think I got two questions. First one about the Japanese guidelines in Japanese politics. It used to be called administrative guidance in Japanese politics, but it was before 1980s, I think, that the government can almost always guide the business sectors. And today, one, it is not the same as before. Two, sometimes business resists. And three, in this BLI case, the government came closer to the business position. So it is an old myth that Japan is a unified actor, acting like a Japan Incorporated. Famous one. And the second question, as long as I understood, is why some nations do not like to accept Chinese investment while others welcome them. I will just suggest to look into the contrast between Beijing consensus and Washington consensus. Some nations support new Beijing consensus, which is very unique, but others still stick to the old, say, Washington consensus, and that it can be a reason for the differences between nations, recipients.
Thank you. That's a very loaded answer, but I'm sure that can open up for yet another seminar. Next, Fabian, please.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for all these relevant questions. Maybe a quick disclaimer before I start answering them. I'm not going to claim that I know the full answer to all of them. So whatever I say, it's also open for discussion. One of the questions that was raised was about a possible learning curve in what China is doing, and in particular concerning Central Asia. In my research, I definitely have observed a learning curve, and the Chinese are really willing to learn and also to adapt what they're doing. They are sensitive to critique. They don't like to be exposed to criticisms. But at the same time, they also are aware that as an international donor, they still have a lot to learn. And for that, they are also studying the activities of other donors, other international donors. And to some extent, if they see that other donors are more successful or more effective, they are willing to learn from that. And also in Central Asia, referring then particularly to the problems that I've mentioned, for instance, the fact that there's hardly any technology transfer taking place, that there's no competence building involved in what China is doing. These are issues that they are willing to change and to improve in the future. One of the other questions, and perhaps this relates a little bit to this, was what the implications are of now other international financial institutions stepping in and then partnering with China, also in Central Asia. So what exactly is the implications of that? Well, I personally think that this definitely will increase the legitimacy of China as a donor, but also it will increase the sustainability of the projects. Of course, it depends which financial institutions we're talking about, but if these are those that I would say fit within the Washington consensus, then they take on board certain principles, including principles that are endorsed by the OECD committee, and these principles are exactly there to maintain the sustainability and to safeguard sustainability and transparency of the aid. And this, of course, as I just mentioned, this should have a positive effect on the legitimacy also of China as a donor. This nicely links up to one of the other questions that was raised by the lady from the European Parliament, so asking if I could do a prediction about what will happen in the future. Will there be more social unrest stirred by China's activities and the negative implications of China's activities in Central Asia? To some extent, I mean, it will not disappear. Also, traditionally, Central Asia is seen to be quite xenophobic. Well, not particularly xenophobic, but sinophobic. And this is something that will not easily go away. China is trying to have some soft power there, and also through cultural diplomacy, but unfortunately not so successfully. So again, China is aware of these issues and it wants to address them, and it's figuring out how to address them best. At the same time, of course, if China's legitimacy will increase because it's partnering up with other donors, then this will, of course, also have a positive effect on how the local population will perceive China. But at the same time, definitely in the short run, this antipathy towards China will definitely remain. Now, the social unrest that has occurred, it's rather, I would say, it's pockets of unrest. It's not something major. Then there was also a question about Kazakhstan. So how come that Kazakhstan is pushing back to some extent, or is asking China to change some of its principles? And for instance, why don't we see this in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan? Well, I mean, Kyrgyzstan to some extent also is pushing back, for instance, but then maybe that's also a domestic issue. There's this whole row about the railroad between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan is always saying to China, well, we're not fully convinced of the benefits of this railroad. It's going to benefit you in the first place, so why would we go ahead? Then again, it's also a domestic issue because of this traditional suspicion of Kyrgyzstan towards Uzbekistan. But then why Kazakhstan? Well, Kazakhstan, of course, is a much more powerful actor than Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the two poorest countries, so basically Kazakhstan has more leverage. But also to some extent you could argue that perhaps Kazakhstan or the domestic elite, so the government perhaps to some extent is a little bit more accountable compared to the government of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And there was also this huge row domestically about possible land grabbing by China in Kazakhstan, which meant that Kazakhstan also had to push back and then tell the Chinese that this plan wouldn't go ahead. This is also linked to another question that was raised. So why are these domestic politicians accepting to enter in this huge debt? What I will say is hopefully not too controversial, but these are authoritarian regimes, and typically authoritarian regimes do not feel accountable. There are elections, but we already know in most cases who will win them. So why would they care about what their population thinks and about whether their country is entering into huge debts? Now, I mean, this is probably a bit exaggerated, but in many ways this is the case. And also typically these post-Soviet leaders, because they all stem back from the Soviet times, they adore these big projects, and they love boasting about these multi-billion projects, and then of course say that it's thanks to them that China wants to invest in their country. This also to some extent answers the question. There were more questions, but for now I will have to leave it at this because I don't want to take up all the time.
Thank you, Anna.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to answer the question on the global governance. On global governance, the EU strategy on China focuses on finding common solutions to global challenges. For example, on G20 forum, since 2016, China has played a constructive role and continues to play towards now on the Argentinian summit, which is coming up later and towards the end of this year. This being said, of course, on the global governance, China has always also jointly, at least, stressed the importance of rules-based international order and the UN as its center. This reflects, of course, that China is a member of the UN Security Council and has played a very constructive role with regards to the Korean Peninsula. Of course, these are my personal views on that also. And on the climate change, for example, on the Paris Agreement and the follow-up, it has been impressive, the commitments China has taken. So these are only a few examples of the governance issues. With regards to the European Parliament, there is a report entitled On the State of the EU-China Relations. It has been already in April approved by the committees relevant, but it will be on now in the whole house in the European Parliament plenary session in September, if I'm not mistaken. For the Chinese investment, very briefly, I would like to say that, of course, there's national sovereignty concerns, perhaps, and as you have already noticed, maybe from the transatlantic part of the world, there's more on investment and forced transfers of intellectual property, etc. So those kind of issues are indeed for further reflection. EU and of course, EU has always expressed its concerns. There are divergences of views. I didn't mention one of them is the human rights, for example. And also, of course, in 2017, when there's a very big Belt and Road conference in China, there was no joint statement because, in fact, also the European Union couldn't really agree on the draft proposed by Chinese side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the three panelists here, Professor Yamada, Fabian and Anna. I want to actually give a request for a round of applause to them only because I think they've been talented with so many questions and they've done their best to answer you. If you do want to have more being discussed, please do it offline. And I really want to thank them very much for bringing a stimulating topic for discussion, because this is a progression from the first, and we can see now the conversation and discussion is getting more engaged. And on that note, may I please request a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. And now